Roberts. I'm the founder of Independent Thinking, and I'm really excited about this evening's webinar. You've got two middle-aged men in knitwear, so it's clearly you're in the right place for an Independent Thinking Autumn Series webinar.
Yes.
Just so, why am I excited? Because of all of the independent thinking associates that we've had involved with independent thinking over the last 26 years, there has only been one that every single associate references, that every single associate talks about either in their presentations or mentions in their books, who has made such a fundamental impact on every single associate's work. And that person is Andrew Curran. Not only does Andrew Curran have an impact on the associates, I know for sure, which is why we have so many people subscribing to these, or registering for this speech, for this webinar, that he has a huge and profound impact on the lives of individual teachers and school leaders, and in turn on the schools that they're involved in. And I know that for sure because I hear that all the time. So we're really pleased that Andrew Curran has remained a part of independent thinking, a fundamental part for all these years, right from when we first met, where he stayed behind after giving his own talk at a head teachers conference. And then I came in the afternoon and he just sat at the front and heckled me all the way through, which was our bonding to begin with. So I'm pleased that he's stayed a part of us for all this time, and I'm pleased that he's now going to be even more active with independent thinking over the coming months and years. Dave Harris is on hand. If anybody wants more information about Andrew, just drop us an email, learn@independentthinking.co.uk, or if you're interested in bookings and things, then go for that. And also just to say, Andrew's book, A Little Book of Big Stuff About the Brain, which is, again, it's transformational in terms of educational practice, is currently on offer with 30% off using the code NQT30, because he's part of the NQT books series that Crown House are putting out with a little bit of discount for the foreseeable future. So again, Nina will give the link to all of that. Right, Andrew, so that's the big build-up. You're a brain specialist, so the brain, how does that work then? What's that all about?
Well, you've just demonstrated it working. So, but ask a sensible question, and then we'll move forward. Yeah.
One of the things that's on your mind at the moment, and has been more so in recent years, and yeah, not in your earlier work, but it's become increasingly important to you, is the work around attachment theory and how that ties in with learning, and how that ties in with your neurobiologist research and your practice. And if you could just elaborate a little bit more, because I know there are certain teachers who haven't yet heard about attachment theory, or might know the name of it, but don't really know what it means or what that means for them in the classroom. So just fill us in on that, please.
So attachment is a concept that started actually back in the 50s with a chap called Bowlby, who very sensibly observed that children develop emotional attachment to their parents. Now that doesn't sound like rocket science, but what developed from that with the help of his co-worker was proper research. We're slightly careful about proper research, but this is good research done carefully and thoughtfully to look and see if it was possible to identify within individuals from their actions the type of parenting experience, or at least principal adult experience they had during their childhood. And what was really extraordinarily interesting was, for the very first time, they turned what's an intuitive understanding, I think that most of us probably have, into something which was identifiable and measurable. Now, Bowlby, huge respect for, he did some extraordinary stuff with his co-workers. I think for me, just to absolutely put my flag on the pole, is that allowed? Yes, to put my flag on the pole, why not? I've been studying this now for several years and combining it with all the work I've done in core science neurobiology for the last 30 years. And I'm increasingly of the opinion that what we're, I think, at the point of being able to think about is a spectrum of attachment experience, which I'm, just for the sake of a simple term, thinking about as attachment disharmonies. So if one gets to the core concept, as I'm thinking about it as a neurobiologist, every single one of us is born with our genetics. We have a crowd of capabilities within us. Some of them will be capabilities that we're really good at maths, but on the same hand, we may therefore not be so good at language or something like that. So I use the term capabilities because it's just who an individual is. They're neither good nor bad, they're just your capabilities. And if that genetic material that we carry has within it our quintessential self, then to express that quintessential self at a basic neurobiological level can be argued as being harmonic. So the more of yourself that you are, that is who your genetics are, then the more harmonic you are with yourself. And just to bring this concept in, it is my personal understanding of, sorry, not my personal understanding, but from all the stuff I've read about the Buddhist concept of enlightenment, if you like, a truly harmonic person who is harmonic with their neurobiology is in fact enlightened, because I think the two things are one and the same thing. And I have someone quoted me recently that there is a modern Buddhist interpretation of enlightenment, which is enlightenment is achieved when you've unlearnt all the connections in you which are not harmonic with who you truly are, which is saying exactly the same thing as I'm saying. So you're born, and from the moment you're born, what I think it's reasonable to argue is your genetic quintessential self has one single overriding command. And that is, you, from the moment you're born, do everything you can to become the person each of your parents need you to be so they love you. So let's just do that statement again. From the moment you're born, your entire genetic makeup is triggered towards you becoming the person your parents need you to be so they love you. Now that's possibly the biggest statement I've ever made about anything in my whole life, because I think attachment is the single most important discovery humanity has ever made, because it makes understandable a person's capabilities as they grow and develop. So you're born as your baby, your whole neurobiology is doing everything it can so you become the person your parents need you to be to love. But how many of us have parents who each as individuals were able to stand right back, leave all their own expectations and ego desires out of the equation, really listen for who you are as a person, and then do everything they can to allow that person full and free expression? That is the requirement for you to become harmonically attached. Now, all parents, or almost all parents, love their kids and absolutely want their best for their kids. But the big problem and the big rider with that is that all parenting, or not all parenting, but almost all parenting, has at its absolute core terror. Because if you ask any parent when they discover they're pregnant, well, what do you want for your child? And they'll come up with a concept, which is what I call the ordinary path, which is they sort of imagine their child, sitting up when they're 6 months old, having a couple of mamas and dadas and papas by the time they're 10 months or 12 months old, and they'll walk by the time they're about, a year and a half, and then they'll go to nursery, and then they'll go to primary school, and then they go to school, and then they'll end up with a career and get married and settle down and have their own kids. And it's sort of it's not, most parents don't put the details to that, but it's a sort of a throw ahead once they discover they're pregnant, that they may not even talk about openly, but which is unconsciously, I think, present in their mind, that you have these sort of expectations of what the ordinary path looks like. Now, the terror that comes from parenting is that from birth to 25, as the parent, you have to get it right so that child at 25 has a job and is getting settled down and having kids. But your perception of what that child's ordinary path looks like may bear very little resemblance to that child's natural path if they were being quintessentially themselves. So you will, through your own terror and desire to get it right for your child, keep inserting stuff into that child. And the child is doing everything it can to become the person you need it to be so you love him or her. So you're basically, you've got really soft putty and you're able to put any old fingerprint and dent and everything into it because it's wide open to that, because the child needs you to love it so that you will protect it and allow it to survive. Human babies are utterly without any ability to survive. A human baby is born. If nobody looks after it, it's dead within 3 days, period. So it's mission critical to survival for each of us as individuals. And this is really ancient neurobiology. This goes back millions and millions and millions of years. Well, probably, in fact, hundreds of millions of years. For you, the individual, brand new born defenseless baby, to get these two adults who can provide your survival needs to love you.
So that's a survival drive in the baby. It has that impetus to want the parents to love it in order that it survives. That's the reason.
Yeah, I mean, the baby has there's nothing conscious about this. This is all happening at a really, really, really primitive level in the brain. In fact, let's just share a screen. So we're going to share a screen here. Find the right screen. Here's the right screen. So if we look at the brain, here's a nice brain. The sort of area we're talking about here, and in fact, let me just, is this working? Yes, it is good. Let me briefly just delineate for you what's what. Spinal cord, a structure called the cerebellum. It's only a short talk today, team, so I can't sit to and do all the writing for you, but it's in the little book of big stuff about the brain. That's the temporal lobe there. At the back is the occipital lobe. That's where we do sight. Here is primary sensory lobe. Here is primary motor lobe. And here is the frontal lobe where we do all our thinking. Temporal lobe, this one here, is where we do all our emotions and feeling. Now, if I lose that brain and cut it in half, you can see that we've got a huge mass of brain here, which is all this great big lump of thinking brain. Well, when you're born, pretty much none of that is active. Obviously, some stuff at the back here around vision and sensation is active, but all this stuff at the front isn't actually active until you're about 18 months to 2 years of age. So the areas of the brain that we're talking about that's doing this very unconscious association, attachment stuff at the very beginning is this stuff down here. This is really primitive survival brain. And it's all the learning you're doing with this is in fact deeply in the unconscious. So that your learning of attachment, certainly in the first 2 to 3 years of life, is predominantly into deeply unconscious structures that you cannot really access. And the research on attachment tells us that by the time you're a year of age, you've largely formed up the core personality that you're going to have when you're 25 years of age. You will build in, at that stage, the basic core emotional and survival responses that you'll still have when you're 25 if you haven't done any work on them. So this is really powerful, formative stuff we're talking about. And that's why I use, that old analogy of the soft clay of a child. It really is a soft clay of a child. And what happens is that those shapes that are put into that clay, by the time you're a year of age, that clay has started to harden so that everything else that happens to you, you then lay down as layers on top of that core personality that you've built. And that core personality is one which, because of who your parents are, is perforce not necessarily going to be a successful personality type when you become an adult. Then your whole life trajectory has been changed. And, you know, the extreme examples of that obviously would be physical abuse, domestic violence, and so on and so forth. We know that they absolutely change people's life trajectory in a dramatic way. But once you start to think about it in terms of a spectrum, so attachment disharmony, so at this end, you've got, you know, really significant attachment pathologies with really, really, you know, deeply unpleasant parenting experiences. But actually, you keep moving down the spectrum and you go, well, hang on a sec, you know, that parent wanted this child to do, for example, to become a teacher. Yeah, and that seems fine. That's all cool. But actually, that child's quintessential neurobiology would make them much better equipped to be a mechanic, for example. And I'm just, you know, randomly picking ideas out of the stratosphere here, or in fact, the aurora. But it's just, I think I'm trying to get every single one of you to start asking those sort of questions. If we view attachment as a continuum from the very securely attached person right through to the really obviously pathologized person, you know, most of us didn't have parents who were attachment savvy and left us with support and the necessary disciplinary limits free to develop as our quintessential selves, because their own love for us and fear of us not being successful as a young adult has made them create an individual who in their imagination would be successful.
So attachment theory not only can include the child who doesn't feel that sense of attachment, but there can be unhealthy attachments where they are fully attached, but it's not in a healthy way. Is that what we're saying?
Yes, absolutely. It's why I'm in my own mind thinking about it as attachment disharmonies, because, you know, children by and large, even once they start to become conscious, are still doing things to please their parents or their teacher in primary school. And then once they reach adolescence, they're 2 or 3 close friends in their adolescent peer group. And of course, once you move into a profession or a job, you're then doing things to try and impress the 2 or 3 people who you want to impress in your job. So the whole concept of attachment isn't just about the baby and the parents for me. It's about the ongoing influences that environment has on your neurobiology, which you then store. You create patterns of nerve cells firing together, so you become hardwired to be that person. And, you know, hey, you can be so purist about this. You can go, well, you know, you shouldn't have any attachment disharmony. Well, the fact is, humanity survives because of attachment disharmony, because everyone, if you like, has to be, or not has to be, but to make society work, socialization has to happen. And at one level, socialization can be viewed as a laying down of patterns from an external environment so you'll be successful. But, you know, so you have to really, you know, keep a very broad mind about these concepts.
And there's a question from Anita. What happens if you don't build those attachments early in life?
So everybody does. That's the point, that we all are surrounded by external environments full of principal emotional individuals, parents, grandparents, a teacher, and so on and so forth. And they are constantly influencing our neurobiology to create attachments. If the question that Anita's asking is it what happens if you do have these parents who can stand back and really listen for who you are and really genuinely allow your quintessential self to develop with sensible limits. So, you know, you say please and thank you, and learn how to interface with the external environment. I think that's very rare. I suspect it's probably less than 5% of the total population. But I think those individuals are just actually chilled, naturally joyous, but if their neurobiology carries with it the sort of neurobiology where they just naturally have high levels of anxiety, they're going to have high levels of anxiety. So, because we're all a massive soup of genetic potentials, if you like. And yeah, there are definite neurobiological traits and trends that will express. So even if you have the most perfect parenting and are your quintessential self, well, that quintessential self has its quintessential capabilities, some of which may be, you know, really quite hard to deal with. But the point about secure attachment, so this concept of an individual who hasn't developed barriers within themselves to being themselves, which is really what we're talking about when you actually get down to it. They're much more emotionally robust. So even if they do end up with high levels of anxiety and find it difficult to deal with it, they're much better equipped to deal with it in terms of their emotional resilience than individuals who have had a lot of pathology put on top of them. So you're pathologized and your neurobiology makes you very anxious. Well, that's going to be a fairly difficult and hard place to be in.
So what is the role then, if we're saying that that initial attachment, for better or for worse, is with the parents, what is the role and the compensatory role that the next circle outside of that can do, whether that's other family members or, and I'm thinking for this audience in particular, the teachers, is the hope? And what that makes me think of as well is a conversation we had a while ago, because you used to do some work in it, was it the Moldovan orphanages and the children?
That's right, yes.
And there was a time where some of these children were being sort of rescued and then brought back into families in the UK. And
yes.
But even though it was a loving, caring family, there was a sense that that too much damage had been done for that child to be able to make those connections. So
I think, no, that's such a good question. I think what we'll do before, to answer that question, is let's look at what we're talking about, i.e. fairly quickly, because I'm keeping an eye on the time. What does learning look like in the brain in terms of the neurobiology of what's happening? Because I think if I spend just 10 minutes or so on that, that carries within it the answer to that question, because the answer to that question is, can you unlearn what you've learned? So let's, any of you who've been to one of my talks, thank you. You obviously have no lives, but if you were at one or have read my book, what you're going to see, you should recognize, because the neurobiology of the brain hasn't changed a lot in the last few million years, so far as we're aware. Here is a nerve cell out in the thinking brain. It has a connection to a nerve cell here in this specialist learning structure, which is called the corpus striatum, which just means a stripy body. I have a funny anecdote to go with that, but you're not going to get it. Hard luck. We haven't got time tonight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to enlarge this connection between the nerve cell out here that's having the thought and the nerve cell in here that's going to start learning happening. It's a learning initiating nerve cell. So here we have coming down from, oh, I wanted that to be yellow. Coming down from the thinking brain, we have a nerve ending. In the corpus striatum, we have this specialist learning cell. And this is how it connects with the nerve ending coming down from the thinking brain. And connected into the side of that is a super specialist connection, which I'm going to explain to you in a second. Right, so that's the basic layout of what we're talking about. You have managed successfully to get your thinking nerve cell to have a thinking thought. Down it comes, releases a chemical called glutamate. Glutamate travels across this gap, binds onto a receptor, and positively stimulates the learning initiating cell. So it actually gets the first step of the learning process up and running. Now, the problem with glutamate is that glutamate is an excitotoxin, and if the blue cell only has glutamate arriving on it, then it will be excited to death, which is not a good survival trait. So another neurochemical called dopamine is released from this little specialist ending here. Some of it sneaks around the side, binds on here, and blocks glutamate. Glutamate also feeds back on itself and inhibits its own production, which any of your biologists will recognize as a standard inhibitory feedback loop. And then the rest of the dopamine binds on here, and this is initially counterintuitive, has a facilitatory effect on the glutamate receptor, which has positively jump-started the blue cell, the learning cell. So scientists made little tiny glass electrodes and they stuck it in the membrane of the learning cell, and they said, okay, what's going on? And what they discovered was that if you look at the activation curve of these cells, oh, that's going to be too big. Excuse me 1 second, just want to make it a wee bit weird. A lot weird, go and become weird. Become smaller. There we go. I don't know what I was doing with it. It was that big, but anyway. So here's a graph. And when they looked at the blue cells, what they found was in the resting state, they were doing exactly nothing. They were pretty much bone idle. When you introduced glutamate, they jump-started, pow, up went their excitation. If it kept going, the blue cell would be excited to death. But when you drop some dopamine in, and this time frame here is milliseconds, these are unbelievably rapid reactions that happen. When you drop some dopamine in, this plateaus out. Now, this all may sound like a whole pile of useless neurobiology to you guys, but in fact, you spent your entire working life trying to set this up. This is called long-term potentiation, and this is called long-term depression. And these are the key neurophysiological requirements of successful learning. I'll explain why in a second. But before we do that, the blue cell, as I've told you in the resting state here, is doing nothing. It is really bone idle and wants to do exactly nothing. And once LTP and LTD have been set up, the blue cell is actively working to get back to doing nothing. It really just doesn't want to do it. But what you can do is re-establish the LTP and LTD. And all of you who are teachers or who have been successful learners yourself know this, that LTP and LTD decays back to resting state where learning stops happening. And what you do is you repeat the data, don't you? You revise or you review the data in a different format the first time around, if you're sensible. And that reestablishes LTP and LTD in exactly the right learning cells so that learning can occur. So what is learning? Well, this changed activation of the blue cell feeds down into the network of neurons it feeds into, and that's probably tens of millions of nerve cells. The brain, as part of this process, knows which of those nerve cells to activate. And when those nerve cells activate, what you can see happening, and you can actually watch this under the right sort of microscope. Let's turn this off. I don't know where it's gone. Maybe there. No, there, that one. So let's make it a green neuron. So a green neuron, and we're only looking at just a tiny little bit of its membrane, receives the impulse from the blue cell, which would come to it via a connection similar to the one we've already viewed. And actually, you can watch it starting to grow out fingers of neuroplasm. and those fingers of neuroplasm look for other nerve cells in their neighborhood who are also growing out fingers of neuroplasm. And when they meet, they fuse together in the way we've seen, so they'll form a new synaptic connection. And they can now transfer information back and forth across this. And that connection, repeated millions of times, forms a network of nerve cells. And an artist's impression of what those look like is this, where probably millions of nerve cells join together to form a repeated pattern of firing called a template. And that template, or those templates in their tens of thousands, are everything you've learned. And that includes emotional reactions, successful and unsuccessful emotional interactions with your principal carers, or your parents, or a granny, or whoever, if your parents are both working and you're looked after by somebody else during the day. And those hardwired in patterns become your core personality. And as we've said, most of those, in terms of the very primitive parts of your brain, are wired in by the time you're about a year old. Now, the question Ian asked, or Anita asked, whoever it was, can you do anything about that? Well, the answer is absolutely. Dopamine, this neurochemical that allows synaptogenesis to occur and allows the LTP reaction to occur, also allows you to break down connections between nerve cells. So there is increasing body of evidence that if you're doing successful psycho-emotional work and actually unlearning damage that you carry or attachment disharmonies that you carry, it is because you are making and breaking synapses. So you can free up those nerve cells that were taken up in these patterns, so you can gain more and more and more of your quintessential self back. And that is called learned secure attachment in attachment literature. So I think, does that answer that question?
Yeah, I think so. It does. It gives hope. This is what when I've talked to teachers about this over the years, that sense of, can I do anything? Is there anything that I can do? Has the damage been done so far? And I think they just want this idea that, just give me some hope that it's worth.
Oh, absolutely. And for me, attachment's the most important discovery humanity's made. The fact you can make and break synapses is the most hopeful discovery humanity's made, because you can genuinely restore your neuronal networks to you. So you can unlearn stuff that has restricted your growth, has altered your life's trajectory in a destructive way, and reintegrate those nerve cells into your totality, but this time under your conscious control.
I did a thunk, I think last year, I wrote, have you finished becoming you yet? And that sort of ties in with this idea that you can...
Yeah, it does, absolutely.
...yourself over a period of life.
And just to reflect on the Buddhist philosophy again, I'm not Buddhist, be clear, but I absolutely get the concept of enlightenment, because for me, enlightenment is just learned secure attachment, really, ultimately, at the end of the day. Buddha apparently was sitting under his lotus tree about 3 days before he died. I mean, he didn't know he was about to die in 3 days. He happens to be, we know with the hindsightoscope that he was about to die. And one of his acolytes came and sat beside him and said, Buddha, you're enlightened. That's just unbelievable. And Buddha looked at the acolyte and said, but I get more enlightened every day. And that's a brilliant, absolutely correct, that it probably isn't a path you can complete, but you can certainly become less disharmonic every day. And theoretically, if you become less disharmonic for long enough, if you live that long and the process works for you, then yeah, you can theoretically gain back your total neuronal population for you.
Okay. A couple of questions, sort of, but just one thing I want to add from a conversation. What you made me think about was a conversation we had years ago, where there seem to be two processes to this unlearning. One is to stop reinforcing the connections that you had.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other one, at the same time, is to actively seek out the new connections. It was like a two-pronged process that you talked about. And
yeah,
Andrew, just hang on. Sorry, just linked to that. A couple of questions. What can we do to help our students unlearn? What do we need to do to support the unlearning of bad attachments? That's a question from Zena and from Joe.
Yeah, really good questions. They're brilliant questions. The answer is, I'm afraid, start with yourself, and just take your time. Don't rush it. Don't cause yourself too much distress, but try and understand which parts of you feel are harmonic and which parts are disharmonic. The process, let me look at this for you. So, it is my personal understanding of the studying neurobiology that to disconnect these connections that we see here, and obviously here and so on, you have to first of all activate them. There's some very interesting work done. So there's a form of imaging called functional magnetic resonance imaging, where you can actually look at the brain doing stuff. And there's some really interesting work that's been done on meditation, particularly breath meditation. Let me turn these off for a second. These pictures here off. See, I'm not going to be able to find where those two circles are. That's probably them. No, it's not. Come, tell me, where are you? And what they did was they looked at what was being activated during breath meditation and what was being suppressed. Some of you who are listening to this may already know this work, but it's really, really interesting, because what all these studies showed is that this structure here, the amygdala, and the structures around it were being switched off during breath meditation. Now, why is that so important? Well, the amygdala is your critical survival structure, but it's the amygdala and the surrounding structure that are part of what is known as the Polyvagal System, which some of you may have heard of. It's basically the first primitive parts of your brain, so all this sort of stuff around here, which gets involved in the very early learning when you're just a baby. And the Polyvagal System, if you read the literature on it, includes this here, which is the posterior limbic brain. And the posterior limbic brain is pretty much your most primitive emotional self, all deeply unconscious, not readily accessible to the conscious brain. And it's where I think there's enough literature now to suggest that's true, for that first year of learning. Now, interestingly, that's not under dopamine control. All this learning here is under a different set of neurochemicals, but the principles remain the same, that the learning occurs by establishing networks of neurons that represent that learning. Breath meditation makes you feel calmer because it suppresses all this stuff. So if you're carrying lots of damage and you do you're a very practiced breath meditator, basically you suppress all the stuff that is making you feel agitated, distressed, stressful, all those sort of stuff, all those sort of things. But the problem is, it is likely that if you're suppressing this, you're not unlearning it. There's two avenues of research into that. The first is that long-time Buddhist meditators, there's some literature suggesting they still carry and have not in any way unlearned psychoemotional traumatic events. And secondly, back in the 70s, I don't know whether any of you remember it, an awful lot of people were put on Valium inappropriately for long periods of time. Valium works by inhibiting this whole area. And when they were taken off the Valium after 10 years, and people realized it wasn't such a good idea, they went straight back to the emotional state they'd been in before they started on Valium. So Valium by itself is a suppressor of this area. And if you suppress this area, you're not unlearning anything, despite the fact your life may be working better actually because you're feeling less anxious and less distressed. So from that and other bits and pieces of research, it's my personal take that you need to actually activate, oh, sorry, I want that back again. You need to activate these areas if you're going to unlearn the synaptic disharmonies within them, so the networks that are disharmonic with you. Now, let's look at a little bit of the function of this area. Let's do it in green. So this area here of the brain is your frontal lobe. It's fully conscious brain, it includes part of the limbic brain. And that's where you think about stuff. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of mindful mentalizing. Well, for me, mindfulness is allowing the amygdala to express emotions into your thinking brain, where you name the emotion honestly: envy, anger, hope, whatever it happens to be, but where you honestly name it. You say, the emotion I'm feeling now is called this, and that is the true name for it. So all emotions, therefore, are neither good nor bad. They simply are neurochemical reactions arising from the amygdala and posterior limbic brain and being transmitted up to your frontal lobes, where you have the ability, if you practice, and it takes a lot of practice, because a lot of attachment is about things like, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. That's really damaging. You cripple people with that, because actually anger, envy, hope, jealousy, all these things, they're all equal actually in the brain. It's what you do with them makes a difference to whether they're destructive or constructive. So mindfulness, name your emotion correctly. Mentalizing means use this thinking brain here, this great massive frontal cortex, to think about why you're feeling that emotion. And that's where you start. Now, there are an awful lot of books out there and a lot of people who can support and help anyone in their path to unlearning attachment disharmonies. Really, everyone's on their own individual path. I'm not in any way going to advise anything. You've got to find that for yourself, because then it'll be the right one for you. This is just the core neurobiology of what I think is going on. By naming the emotion and then thinking about why you're feeling it, you're actually activating it, because with practice, once you've named it successfully and start thinking intellectually about why you're feeling it, you will start gradually, and this is where you may need support either from reading or another person or both those things, to relive the emotion, to actually ignite those synapses again, ignite that network, so you're starting to re-feel the emotion. But now, actually, do you know what? You're grown up, and if you learnt that emotion when you're 3 years of age, as a grown-up, there are very different responses you can have to that event or the events which led you to building an attachment disharmonic neural pathway when you're 3 years of age. And of course, this is widely reported across the literature. All I'm doing is giving you a bit of the neurobiology of what's going on. You activate the synapses. Because you've activated synapses, you can now change them. And this is this wonderful message of hope. You can unlearn those connections so that those nerve cells then become free for you again. How does this reflect into the classroom? Well, actually, dopamine, this core neurochemical we were talking about for learning in the, actually, yes, in the intellectual, emotional brain, but also in your thinking brain, Dopamine secretion in the brain, 93% of it, is under the control of your emotional limbic brain. This chap here, the limbic system that we're talking about. If you have good emotional harmony with yourself, you're going to naturally have good emotional harmony with another human being in front of you. And that in and of itself is role modeling to them a different way of being. And if that is something that exists across your entire school, so creating a school where mindful mentalizing is a natural part of the process, where it's well supported by people with experience and knowledge, and where each individual human in that school, whether they be child or adult, is respected, listened to, and understood as that individual human being. And that over time creates an environment of reparenting for everybody in the school. And that reparenting done with love, generosity, and where necessarily sensible disciplinary boundaries and sensible behaviors is in and of itself a healing process.
Wow. Okay. You've answered some of the questions. John is asking, he's saying, you know, great presentation, Andrew. This has huge implication for relationships education and therapeutic approaches to behavior management. Would you care to comment? And Barbara is also saying, can you name a few of the approaches used successfully in education or by psychologists to reroute made neuro pathways? If I can just say one other thing before you answer that, you reminded me of a conversation we had a few years ago where we talked about the idea of STAR, stop, think, act, review. Or
yes, exactly.
And
stop, think, act, review is mindful mentalizing. So instead of, so your amygdala will drive you for an immediate response, pow, like that, react, which is act. But if you stop first, the act of stopping means you're taking conscious responsibility for your amygdala's emotions. And you've got an amygdala in each hemisphere. So there's two of the little buggers buzzing away in there. You stop, you say, no, hang on a sec. I recognize this as my amygdala wanting an immediate reaction. You then think, and that thinking is mindful mentalizing. I'm feeling this emotion, name the emotion correctly. Okay, why am I feeling this emotion? Because this traffic warden who's just put a ticket on my car reminds me of my grandfather who used to batter me about the head with a stick. Yeah, you can then act. So instead of actually abusing the traffic warden, you go, I'm really sorry, you're quite right. I'm parked for more than 20 minutes on these double yellow lines. It's my bad. Yeah, because that then becomes a reasonable, securely attached response. Because the traffic warden is just doing his job. And I bet you he's doing it correctly. He's not giving you a ticket just for fun. He's giving you a ticket because actually you have broken the law. And that's your responsibility. You got to own it. And then reflect on what happens. Because what might happen is a traffic warden who hasn't had anyone saying anything nice to him for the last 7 years goes, you're right, mate, and tear up the ticket. That's not likely, incidentally. Traffic wardens are usually not bred like that. But you know what I mean? I'm just, it's a hopeful, we're having a hopeful talk here.
Yeah.
But, so, and the answer to the second question is, and here we go, I'm going to share the screen again, is possibly one of the most exciting concepts of education that exists out there at the moment. Now, go away. I want you to go away. Thank you. And that is this thing called expeditionary learning. Expeditionary learning is after an outward bound chap who created a concept. Oh, sorry about that. That's me. Who created a concept of learning based around actually outward bound, but the ideas can be carried forward in ways which actually do include project and exploration, but don't necessarily mean you have to go out camping for 6 months a year in the wilds of Snowdonia, though actually that's a lovely thing to do, probably. Expeditionary learning. Look it up, there's a really good Wikipedia entry. This, in fact, is taken from the Wikipedia entry, but my wife, Andrea, who is head teacher of a primary school in Knowsley, has with these ideas and a whole encyclopedic knowledge of the pedagogy, produced just an extraordinary school in a really, really, really deprived area. So I can tell you factually, this works. I'll not read all this out to you, but here's the idea: is the primacy of self-discovery, the having of wonderful ideas. Please understand, this is not wishy-washy. This is really carefully worked out. And when you actually get into the grit and the guts of expeditionary learning, you go, no. There's nothing easy about this. This is a really, really, really tough thing to do. And it takes about 3 years to get a school up to the sort of level of functioning which makes these work. Responsibility for learning, empathy and caring. Success and failure, collaboration, competition, diversity and inclusion, the natural world. I mean, you read the headings and you go, wow, those are just like wonderful headings. Solitude and reflection. How many of you ever do solitude and reflection? And just in a moment, we're going to do a last exercise before we finish. And then service and compassion. This whole concept of we are crew, not passengers. We're all responsible for each other, but particularly responsible for ourselves, our actions, and our actions in our environment. I really can't recommend it. It really, as you gathered, I really connect with it as a learning approach, because it carries within it the totality of everything I've been talking about today, including this whole concept of setting a whole new attachment agenda for each of these children to experience. But let's...
Andrew, can I, there's a few more questions. I just tied up with something around teenagers in puberty. Just to say what you're describing there, the idea of the crew, not the passengers. I've seen that in a school that's a restorative practice school.
Yep,
coaching circles as well. And it fits in nicely. If you check, and Nina will put the link in, the video that our conversation I had from our What Now Week conversations with Mark Finnis around restorative practice and Simon Flowers from Carr Manor School in Leeds. There's more information about that there. Now, again, as an example of schools that are making it work. They might not have known about the neuroscience when they did it, but they just could see.
Yeah, exactly right. And that's a point for everyone to take away. I've told you nothing this evening you don't already know. I've just told you neuroscience about why these things work. That's all I've done.
In terms of the teenagers and things, there's two things about the brain that you told me again a while back that is so important. One is the idea that we aren't fully a mature human adult until about the age of 25, which is important to bear in mind.
That's correct, yeah.
And the other one, and which I think is even more important, is the idea that you can't be older than your brain. So can you just very briefly, if you can, this trajectory from birth
So if we take attachment doesn't just occur in the first year of life. Attachment's occurring all your life, because it's just about emotional connections with another human being, and how harmonic or disharmonic that is to you. But don't forget, once you've built up a lot of attachment disharmonies, the individuals you're going to feel most harmonic with are the ones that connect with those attachment disharmonies. Which is why changing your friends, changing your environment is sometimes becomes very necessary as part of a growth paradigm, because you will have selected your friends and your environment based on your attachment harmonies, but also your disharmonies. So it can be very hard to unlearn your disharmonies if you need them to get on with that person, if you see what I mean. And that person may not want to grow, so you may be growing or not. So yeah, one of the concepts that comes is this concept of parts of yourself get stuck at different ages. And that's just really attachment, so I was talking about. So most people have a 2-year-old, and most people have a 5-year-old, most people have a 10-year-old, and most people have a 15-year-old, still existing as a person, as an entity inside them. But they're not aware of it because they've just amalgamated all those people together. But it's those personas are actually attachment fragments, if you like. they've been helpful at the time. So your 3-year-old who made sure not to cross dad because dad would hit you by the head with his hand was a really useful person to have when you were 3. But now you're 28 or 51, actually may have no relevance in life at all, because you wouldn't let your dad do that to you. But if you haven't actually learned that 3-year-old, it's still there. And if the right environmental triggers come along, that will trigger that 3-year-old. So to say you're mature when you're 25 is, all we're talking about is your neurobiological capabilities are at an adult level of efficiency and performance. But actually doesn't mean you're emotionally 25. You may, in fact, live your life as a 7-year-old. So I'm aware of the time. So let me finish with just a little thing, because solitude and reflection. How many adults do that in this day and age? More perhaps, but still not enough. So what I would like you all to do, please, for me, and I'm going to time it, so it's going to be for 2 minutes, is I want to ask yourself the following 4 questions. Do you understand yourself? Are you good for your self-esteem? Are you good for your self-confidence? And finally, do you feel emotionally engaged with yourself? So if everyone just like to get comfortable in their seat, and of course you're probably sitting at home in your office and something that actually is comfortable, unlike the usual lecture theatres or school halls that I do this in. And I say we're going to take exactly 2 minutes. Ask those questions of yourself, and I'll tell you when 2 minutes are up. Now, still sitting, what I want you to do is see if you can find inside you a self-image. It can be all sorts of things, a flower, my particular one is a little blue orb, whatever it is. And now what I want you to do is reach in with both your hands, gentle, strong, warm hands, and cup yourself in your hands. And then when you're ready, just come back out into the present. Be aware that someone is understood, properly understood as who they are as a whole person. That's fantastic for their self-esteem. That in turn builds their self-confidence, and they feel emotionally engaged. And this, of course, is just love. But love practiced without ego, which is the hardest love to practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Zena's genuinely crying. Love practice without ego, which is the hardest thing to practice. I think that's so important. There's so much that we said that's important. So thank you for that. Thank you for the stuff that some of us might have read before or heard you say about before. Like we were talking earlier before we came on air, it's how important it is to keep revisiting, keep coming back.
Yes. Yes.
Are we using this information? And then also so much new information as well coming through, and so many new connections that you've made from the neurobiology to the practice to the humanity, the reference to the Buddhism as well. That might surprise some people, but there's a whole area of research, of neurobiological research about Buddhism. There's a book called Why Buddhism is True, which looks at the science of Buddhism, and
yes,
it's worth having a look at that as well. There is plenty of questions. There's about 10 questions which we haven't had time to answer. So thank you for all the questions. If there's any that you desperately want us to put to Andrew, just email me, ian@independentthinking.co.uk, and I'll have a go. But Andrew's a busy man as well, but to do what we can. If you're interested in booking Andrew, either in the real world for your school or for your organisation, when we get a real world back, then drop us a line, learn@independentthinking.co.uk, or to do anything virtual. You know, we're doing a lot of virtual online work at the moment as well through the pandemic, so we're happy to do that as well. So the same thing. His profile's on our website, independentthinking.com. Just put his name in and you'll see more information there. This recording will go out in the next little while. We'll let you know about that. And it's just great to hear you, Andrew, do your stuff, and you are profoundly impactful on everybody who hears you do your stuff. You make something incredibly complex, not only easy to understand, you bring out the humanity in it, and in doing so you bring out the humanity in us all, and you give us hope. So thank you for that. Thank you, Nina, in the background.
And can I say thank you as well? Those are lovely things being said in the chat. Namaste. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you all. See you again. Stay safe. Bye now.